A millionaire married his friend's ugly sister as a joke, but he didn't expect what she would do to him. The private dining room of the city's most exclusive restaurant was illuminated by a massive chandelier hanging above a marble table where crystal glasses clinked in celebratory toasts. The scent of expensive wine blended with the aroma of perfectly seared steak, while the muffled sound of jazz filled the air. For Henry Reynolds, this was just another ordinary night. Seated at the table, he tossed the linen napkin onto his lap and leaned back in his chair, a subtle smirk forming on his lips. Across from him, Brandon Fletcher, his longtime friend and business partner, laughed carelessly as he swirled his drink in the glass. "You know, Henry, I think I've seen this movie before," Brandon teased, nodding toward the stunning woman who had just left Henry's table, casting him an enamored glance. "You use the same charm, promise the world, and in the end, well, you always win." Henry raised an eyebrow, amused. "And why would I change a method that always works?" Brandon chuckled again, but this time there was something different in his expression, a spark of challenge. "I think you only play it safe. You only go for women who are already halfway in love with you before you even open your mouth." Henry shook his head dismissively. "That's called knowing how to choose." Brandon leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "And what if I told you I have a challenge for you?" Henry let out a quiet laugh. Challenges were his specialty. "I'm listening." Brandon took a sip of his wine before dropping his words with a provocative tone. "I want to see you get married for 6 months to someone completely outside your type." The silence between them lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough for Henry to realize his friend was serious. "A marriage?" Henry laughed in disbelief. "Are you out of your mind?" "Oh, not just any marriage, a contract, 6 months, no escape clauses, and the person has already been chosen." Henry crossed his arms, still skeptical but undeniably intrigued. "I'm curious. Who is this woman so outside my type?" Brandon smirked, as if he were about to drop a bombshell. "My sister, Charlotte." This time, Henry burst into laughter. "You've got to be kidding me." "I'm not," Brandon replied, still with that half-smile. "You brag about being irresistible, about having any woman at your feet. Well then, I want to see you win over Charlotte." Henry knew Charlotte Fletcher by sight, but had never exchanged more than a polite nod with her. He knew she was a university professor, a social activist, and, unlike most women he knew, seemed completely uninterested in luxury or status. "Would she even agree to this?" Henry asked, narrowing his eyes. "That's the interesting part," Brandon said, clearly enjoying the moment. "Charlotte doesn't have to like the idea. She just has to agree to the deal." Henry drummed his fingers on the table, considering the proposal. A fake marriage, 6 months, and the only rule was to make a woman who had never shown any interest in him fall under his spell. It seemed simple enough. "And what do I get out of this? Besides the satisfaction of proving me wrong?" Brandon grinned. "If you manage to win over Charlotte and actually get her emotionally involved, I'll give you my share of the new real estate project in Copacabana." Henry let out a low whistle. That was an interesting offer. "And if I lose?" "You donate $1 million to Charlotte's NGO." Henry evaluated the challenge for a few more moments, but deep down he already knew his answer. "Deal." They shook hands, sealing the bet. Brandon looked a little too pleased, which sparked a slight unease in Henry. "Just a warning, my friend," Brandon said, picking up his glass again. "Charlotte isn't like the others. She doesn't care about money or status. If you think this is just another game, you might be the one who loses in the end." Henry just smiled. He never lost. 2 days later, Henry stood in front of a small cafe downtown, a quiet place filled with stacks of books and the rich aroma of strong coffee in the air. Charlotte Fletcher was sitting at a corner table, a laptop open in front of her, an untouched coffee cup beside it. He approached confidently, but the moment she looked up, he realized this meeting wouldn't be easy. Unlike the women he usually charmed, Charlotte didn't look away, didn't smile, and was definitely not impressed. "You must be Henry Reynolds," she said, calmly closing her laptop. "And you're Charlotte Fletcher," he replied in the same tone, taking a seat across from her without waiting for an invitation. She crossed her arms, studying him for a moment. "My brother already told me about the ridiculous deal you two made." Henry smirked. "That saves us some time." Charlotte leaned forward slightly, her gaze carrying a sharpness he hadn't expected. "Let's get something straight. I don't trust you. I know exactly what kind of man you are. So if you think you can win me over with expensive gifts and fancy dinners, you might as well give up now." Henry kept his smile, but something inside him twisted. This was new. "Are you saying you accept the deal?" Charlotte grabbed a napkin and scribbled something on it quickly before sliding it toward him. "These are my conditions. No real involvement, no seduction games, just a contract, nothing more." Henry picked up the napkin and read her demands. Cold, direct rules. For the first time, he felt like he wasn't in control. He looked up at her, analyzing her for a few seconds. Then, carefully folding the napkin, he smiled. "Looks like we have a deal." Charlotte simply extended her hand, sealing the agreement informally. Henry shook it, feeling something different in the exchange. She wasn't like the others, and that only made things more interesting. Henry wasn't sure what to expect after the agreement. Maybe that Charlotte would hesitate, show some doubt, or even a slight hint of nervousness, but she showed nothing. As soon as he signed the contract, she simply tucked the papers into her bag, stood up, and said, "I'll see you on the wedding day." And then she left. Just like that. No theatrics, no exaggerated reactions, just a sharp professionalism that left him slightly uncomfortable. He was used to being the center of attention, to seeing women vying for even a sliver of his interest. But with Charlotte, nothing, not even a glance of curiosity. She was a mystery, and Henry hated not having the answers. 2 days later, Henry was in his lawyer's office, reviewing the contract details. "Are you sure about this?" Benjamin, his trusted lawyer, asked, frowning as he flipped through the documents. "This marriage might seem like a fun stunt now, but 6 months can feel like an eternity with the wrong person." Henry smirked, leaning back in the leather chair. "Let's call it a social experiment." "You mean a ridiculous bet? Whatever works for you." Benjamin sighed and signed the paperwork. "All set. Now all that's missing is the bride." Henry picked up a copy of the contract and skimmed through it quickly. None of the clauses surprised him. He already knew that Charlotte would keep everything impersonal. No unnecessary physical contact, no emotional involvement, no intimacy beyond what was necessary to maintain the appearance of a functional couple in public. If it were any other woman, he would have already found a way to break through that coldness. But with Charlotte, he suspected it would be different, and that only made him more intrigued. The wedding was a discreet event, at least by Henry's standards. No media photographers, no grand parties, no massive guest list. Just a few close friends and Charlotte's family, who watched everything with palpable suspicion. Charlotte wore an elegant white pantsuit, simple and understated. Her hair was pulled back into a bun, with no elaborate styling, no excessive makeup. If she felt anything about the wedding, she didn't show it. The officiant read the formal vows, the papers were signed, and before Henry could even process it, he was married. No kisses, no declarations, no emotion. When they stepped out of the small ceremony, a driver was already waiting to take them to Henry's apartment. He held the door open for her, but Charlotte didn't even hesitate before getting in. On the way there, she stared out at the city through the window, silent. "Have you always been like this?" Henry asked, breaking the silence. Charlotte turned away from the view and raised an eyebrow. Like what? Cold. She let out a low chuckle. You're confusing coldness with objectivity. I just have no reason to pretend to be excited about this marriage. Henry smirked, teasing. That would be a great argument if it didn't sound like an excuse. Charlotte didn't reply. She just turned back to the window. Her indifference was irritating and fascinating at the same time. Henry's apartment was on the top floor of a luxury building in the heart of the city. High ceilings, designer furniture, everything impeccably organized. As soon as they walked in, he glanced at Charlotte, waiting for some reaction, but she simply set her bag down on the couch and crossed her arms. "I'll be staying in the guest room," she said matter-of-factly. Henry laughed. That was fast. I thought you were smart enough to know there wouldn't be any surprises. He just shrugged. I wasn't expecting anything different. Charlotte glanced around, then pulled a notepad from her bag. We need to establish a routine to avoid any unnecessary conflict. Henry narrowed his eyes. You made a schedule for a fake marriage? She ignored him. During social events, we'll maintain the appearance of a minimally functional couple. Outside of that, we live separate lives. No romantic dinners, he teased. No dinners, no breakfast, no unnecessary conversations. Henry grinned. Noted. Charlotte studied him for a moment and, with nothing else to say, grabbed her bag and headed for the guest room. Henry watched her disappear down the hallway. Something inside him told him this marriage was going to be far more complicated than he had imagined, and for the first time, he wasn't sure if he was the one in control. In the first few days of marriage, Henry realized that Charlotte was more predictable than he had expected, but not in the way he had imagined. There were no arguments, no provocations, no resistance of any kind. She simply didn't see him. If he was in the living room, she went to the office. If he turned on the TV, she put on headphones. When she got home, she walked past him as if he were just another piece of furniture. It wasn't hostility. It was absolute indifference. And it was starting to get on his nerves. Henry had always been in control. He chose, he led, he dictated the course of things. And now he was married to a woman who wasn't impressed by anything about him. That was the exact moment he realized this sham marriage would be far more challenging than he had anticipated. On Friday night, while reviewing contracts in his home office, he received a message from Brandon. Brandon, dinner at my mum's house tomorrow. Your presence is mandatory. Bring your lovely wife. Henry chuckled. Of course, Brandon would make sure to throw him into an uncomfortable situation. He left the office and walked into the living room, where he found Charlotte sitting on the couch, legs crossed, a book resting on her lap. The soft glow of the lamp cast shadows across her face, but what caught his attention was her serenity. How could someone be so calm in a fabricated marriage? We have dinner at your mother's house tomorrow, he informed her. Charlotte didn't even lift her eyes from the book. You have a commitment. I don't. Henry raised an eyebrow. You're my wife. She sighed, closing the book calmly. A wife by contract. I didn't sign a family gathering clause. Henry smiled, amused. So that means I can go alone and let your family speculate that our marriage is already falling apart. Charlotte shot him a warning look. He was pushing her, and they both knew it. What time? 8. She picked up her book and walked toward the hallway. I'll think about it. Henry chuckled. He already knew the answer. The next evening, Charlotte descended the apartment stairs, wearing an elegant burgundy dress, simple yet striking. No extravagance, no excessive glitter, no flashy accessories. Simple yet commanding. Henry noticed that she exuded confidence, as if she needed nothing but herself to be noticed. Something wrong? She asked, catching him staring. He smirked. Not at all. You're just less hostile than usual. Charlotte grabbed her purse and walked out without responding. On the way to the Fletcher house, the silence between them was heavy, but not uncomfortable. Henry noticed that despite her composed expression, there was a hidden tension in her eyes. "You don't like family dinners?" he asked. She kept her eyes on the window. "I do. I just don't like the reason behind this particular dinner." Henry leaned slightly toward her. "And what would that be?" Charlotte turned her head, her eyes glinting with irony. "You." He laughed, leaning back against the car seat. "I'd say I'm a great reason to bring a family together." "Sure, especially when no one believes this marriage is real." Henry stayed silent. She wasn't wrong. The Fletcher home was warm and full of memories, completely different from the cold, minimalist spaces Henry was used to. Family photos lined the walls, books filled every available space, and the air smelled of homemade food. As soon as they walked in, all eyes turned to them. Brandon greeted them with a smirk. "Finally, the couple of the year has arrived." Margaret, Charlotte's mother, was setting the table, her gaze analytical. Her smile was polite, but Henry could feel her watching him with caution. During dinner, Henry kept the conversation light. He answered questions about his work, commented on his travels, even threw in a few playful remarks about Charlotte's charming personality. But Margaret didn't seem convinced. "You two don't seem particularly connected," she noted as she cut a piece of steak. Henry smiled, glancing at Charlotte. "She's a difficult woman, but I like a challenge." Charlotte picked up her wineglass and took a slow sip. "And I like my peace, which makes this arrangement a bit complicated." Brandon chuckled. "A marriage of opposites. Nothing like time to smooth things out." That was when Margaret sighed and looked at her daughter. "Your father would have been happy to see you like this." The air in the room changed. The tension became palpable. Charlotte remained composed, but Henry noticed the slight press of her lips together, the quiet effort to hide any emotional reaction. He already knew that her father, George Fletcher, had passed away, but only now did he realize that his name still lingered in this house like a ghost. Henry sensed that this dinner wasn't just about testing their marriage. It was also about the absence of a man who had left an irreparable void. Brandon picked up on the shift in atmosphere and changed the subject, trying to ease the tension. But Henry couldn't stop watching Charlotte. The way she kept her posture straight, the way she avoided her mother's eyes, the way she held her wineglass just a little tighter than necessary. Henry Reynolds' office had always been a sanctuary of absolute control. From the top of his skyscraper, he commanded multi-million-dollar deals without ever losing his grip on the situation. But that morning, as he analyzed the latest financial reports, he realized that something was very wrong. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered, flipping through the pages in irritation. Across from him, Nicholas, his CFO, had a grave expression. "The numbers don't lie, Henry. Our real estate investments are stagnating. Some projects were shut down before they even got off the ground because, well, there's growing resistance." Henry looked up, impatient. "Resistance from who?" Nicholas took a deep breath, as if he knew he was about to pour gasoline on a fire. "Activist groups, social movements that have been pressuring politicians and environmental agencies against your expansions." Henry frowned. "That's always been a thing. Since when have we been losing money over it?" Nicholas turned his laptop screen toward him. "Since these groups got a face, a name, a leader who knows how to play the game." Henry's blood ran cold when he saw the image on the monitor. Charlotte Fletcher, dressed in a simple blouse, holding a microphone, she spoke before a crowd. The video caption displayed a snippet of her speech. "We cannot allow the greed of a few to destroy the rights of many. People come before profit." Henry felt his jaw tighten. His wife, the woman he shared an apartment with, exchanged calculated provocations and silences with, was sabotaging his business. And worse, she was winning. This can't continue. That was the first thought that crossed Henry's mind as he watched the third video of Charlotte giving a speech. Over the years, he had faced competitors, economic crises, even drastic market shifts. But he had never dealt with something like this. He needed to understand how she was doing it, and more than that, he needed to stop her. That night, when Charlotte got home, he was already waiting in the living room, elbows resting on his knees, swirling a glass of whiskey in his hand. "Did you have a productive day?" he asked bluntly. Charlotte stopped by the table, tossing her bag onto the couch. "As productive as any other." Henry smirked. "I imagine. Sabotaging multi-million-dollar deals must be exhausting." For the first time, Charlotte actually looked at him. "What are you talking about?" He picked up the remote and pressed a button. One of her speeches began playing on the TV. Charlotte's face remained impassive. "Oh, that. Yes, that." He stood up slowly, locking eyes with her. "Tell me, wife, how long have you been trying to destroy my business?" Charlotte crossed her arms, making no effort to rush her response. "I'm not trying to destroy anything, Henry. I'm just defending something. You're making me lose money." "You already have enough money." Henry let out a disbelieving laugh. "You talk like I'm some cartoon villain, Charlotte, like everything I do is pure selfishness." "Isn't it?" she shot back, tilting her head slightly. He hated the way she spoke to him like that, like she could see right through him. "You don't even know what you're talking about." "I know enough to understand that your company only thinks about profit, without caring about the impact it has." Henry scoffed. "You think pretty speeches solve problems? You think manifestos stop people from going hungry? No. Money does that. Jobs do that." Charlotte studied him for a moment, then grabbed her bag again. "This conversation isn't going anywhere." And without another word, she left, leaving Henry alone, irritated and, for the first time in a long time, in doubt. In the following days, Henry did something he had never done before. He started investigating Charlotte, not in the traditional way, not like a jealous husband, but as a businessman who wanted to understand his competition. He read articles about the social projects she led, watched videos of her speeches, analyzed the NGOs involved, and the more he researched, the fewer flaws he could find. The projects she defended made sense, the numbers were real, the positive impact was undeniable. He infiltrated one of the projects to see it up close, spent an entire day in one of the communities where his company planned to build a luxury development, talked to residents, listened to their stories, saw what Charlotte saw, and for the first time, he felt like he might be on the wrong side. That night, Henry came home exhausted but restless. Charlotte was on the balcony, looking out at the city, a cup of tea in her hands. She noticed his presence but didn't turn around. "You went to see my projects today." It wasn't a question. Henry stopped beside her, not denying it. "I did." A heavy silence settled between them. "And?" she asked, straight to the point. He ran a hand through his hair, letting out a frustrated sigh. "I didn't expect it to be so real." This time Charlotte turned to face him, her eyes holding something he couldn't decipher. "You're saying you didn't expect me to be right?" Henry let out a humorless laugh. "Something like that." She shook her head, looking back at the city. "You've always seen the world as numbers and graphs, Henry. I see it as people." Henry remained silent for a moment, because for the first time he didn't have a ready-made argument, and that, more than anything, scared him. The feeling of control was slipping through Henry's fingers like fine sand. For the first time in years, he felt like he was losing his grip on a situation, and that unsettled him more than any financial loss ever could. Lately, his mind had been clouded. He could no longer see his decisions the same way. The confidence he had always had in running his business now seemed questionable. Charlotte was slowly cracking an armor he once thought was indestructible, and then a new piece of information surfaced, and everything got worse. "I need you to dig deeper into the investigation." Henry was on the phone with Nicholas, his CFO. The crisis in his business couldn't just be a coincidence. There had to be something bigger going on. Hours later, he received a detailed report. Sitting at his office desk, he flipped through the pages, a growing weight settling in his chest. And then, in the middle of the documents, he found the name that made his blood run cold. George Fletcher. His gaze ran over the words, trying to absorb the information. Years ago, Reynolds Enterprises had been directly responsible for the bankruptcy of Charlotte's father's publishing house. An aggressive market move, a real estate expansion project that forced the publishing company to shut down, crushed under insurmountable debt. The same project he himself had signed off on years ago without a second thought. The publishing house didn't survive. George lost everything, and not long after, he died. Henry felt a lump in his throat. Reynolds Enterprises hadn't killed George Fletcher directly, but it had destroyed everything he built. And now, Henry was married to the daughter of the man his company had helped ruin. Charlotte got home later than usual that night. Henry was already waiting for her. She noticed the way he looked at her the moment she walked in. "Is something wrong?" she asked, taking off her coat. He hesitated for a second. How do you tell someone that you destroyed their life without even realizing it? "Can we talk?" Charlotte frowned. That was way too serious for a simple good evening. Henry took a deep breath. "I found out something important." She caught the shift in his tone, and for the first time she hesitated. "What is it?" Henry ran a hand down his face, trying to find the right words, but there was no gentle way to say it, so he just said it. "It was my company that caused your father's publishing house to go bankrupt." The silence that followed was brutal. Charlotte didn't move. Her gaze stayed locked on him, as if her mind were trying to process the words, searching for a flaw in the logic. "What?" she finally asked, her voice low. Henry picked up one of the documents and handed it to her. Charlotte took the papers with steady hands, but as she read, her breath started to waver. The names, the dates, the figures, it was all there. And then, when she reached the last page, her body tensed. Henry saw the way her fingers clenched the paper, the way her shoulders stiffened. Then she looked at him, but it wasn't shock in her eyes. It was hatred, a cold, razor-sharp hatred. "You knew about this all along." Her voice was sharp as a knife. "No, I found out today, and I—" "And you what?" She took a step back, as if the idea of touching him was revolting. "You came to justify yourself, to apologize." Henry closed his eyes for a second. "I know nothing I say will change what happened." But what, Henry?" Charlotte threw the papers to the floor. "You want to convince me that you're sorry, that this shook you." Henry didn't know what to say. For the first time, he had no answer. "My father died believing he had failed," she said, her voice raw with emotion. "He thought he wasn't good enough, that he should have done more. But it wasn't his fault, was it? It was your company. It was you." Henry felt the blow. There was no defense, no justification. Charlotte took another step back, and Henry realized that in that moment he had lost her completely. "I want a divorce." The words hit like a hammer. Henry felt the impact, like a physical blow. "Charlotte, I don't want to hear another word." Her gaze was firm, decisive. She wasn't just angry about the past. She was angry because he was her present, because she had been sleeping beside the man who helped destroy her life without even knowing it. She grabbed her keys, her bag, and walked out. Henry stood there, unmoving, staring at the papers scattered on the floor. For the first time in his life, he felt the true weight of his actions. And for the first time, he had no idea how to fix what he had done. Henry had never known what it felt like to be powerless. All his life, he had believed that money could solve any problem. But now, sitting in his office, staring at the pile of documents on his desk, he realized just how insignificant his power was compared to the damage he had caused. Since Charlotte had left, he hadn't heard from her. No calls, no messages. The apartment felt emptier, colder. Her silence was deafening. He tried to ignore the tightness in his chest, convincing himself it was just wounded pride, but it wasn't. It was something much worse. He had hurt the only woman who had never even tried to impress him, the only one who had ever challenged him. And now, he had no idea how to get her back. But he knew one thing: standing still wasn't an option. Henry spent days studying the documents about George Fletcher's publishing house bankruptcy. Every number, every decision that had led to its collapse. The more he read, the more disgusted he felt with himself. He couldn't change the past, but he could change the future. The following week, he called a meeting with his lawyers and financial specialists. "I want the Fletcher publishing house rebuilt, from scratch." The looks around the room were of absolute shock. "Mr. Reynolds, rebuilding a company that failed years ago makes no commercial sense." "I'm not asking if it makes sense," Henry cut in, his voice cold. "I'm telling you we're doing it." Silence. "And the administration?" one of them asked. "Do you want Reynolds Enterprises to have a stake in it?" Henry ran a hand over his chin, thinking for a moment. He knew that if the publishing house had any ties to his empire, Charlotte would never accept it. "I want it to operate completely independently, no involvement from my company." The lawyer frowned. "So you're literally funding a project with no commercial benefit?" Henry let out a humorless laugh. "For the first time, yes. But rebuilding the publishing house wasn't enough. He needed to change his own empire. Reynolds Enterprises was known for its aggressive market tactics. Smaller companies were crushed, communities displaced, land taken without concern for social consequences. He needed to change that. When Henry announced that Reynolds Enterprises would begin investing in sustainable and socially responsible business practices, the backlash was immediate. The investors were furious. "This is insanity," one of the shareholders shouted during a board meeting. "You want to turn a billion-dollar empire into a charity." Henry remained calm, but his eyes were sharp. "I want to turn this company into something that doesn't need to destroy people to make a profit. You're going to sink this company with these changes. If you insist on this, we'll remove you as CEO." The threat lingered in the air. Henry knew they meant it, but for the first time he wasn't afraid of losing. He had spent his entire life believing that power came from control. Now he understood that true power came from choosing to do the right thing. The problem was, he needed a strong enough argument to convince those men that ethics and profit could coexist, and there was only one person who could help him do that. Henry spent 3 days rehearsing what he would say before finally working up the courage to face her. Since she had left the apartment, Charlotte had been staying at her mother's house. When she opened the door and saw him standing there, her expression was pure surprise. And then, in an instant, she shut down. "What do you want, Henry?" He hated the coldness in her voice. "I need your help." Charlotte let out a dry laugh. "You've got to be joking." "I'm not." She crossed her arms. "You have exactly 1 minute before I shut this door in your face." Henry took a deep breath and got straight to the point. "My board wants to remove me as CEO because I'm trying to turn Reynolds Enterprises into a more responsible company. But if I can prove that sustainable and ethical changes can still be profitable, I can stop them." Charlotte stared at him, stunned. "You want me to help you convince a bunch of greedy investors that ethics and profit can coexist? You're the only person I know who can do it." She said nothing. For a moment, Henry saw conflict in her eyes, but then she laughed bitterly. "This is ridiculous. Now you want my help, after everything?" Henry ran a hand through his hair. "I know I can't change what happened. I know you might never forgive me, but this matters, not just to me, but to what you believe in." Charlotte pressed her lips together, hesitant, and then, to his surprise, she sighed and said, "Send me the reports. If the numbers check out, I'll consider it." 2 days later, Henry walked into the Reynolds Enterprises boardroom with Charlotte by his side. The investors immediately noticed her presence. "Who is this?" one of them asked. Henry smiled. "The only person in this room who understands social impact better than any of you." Charlotte took control of the presentation, shocking everyone. Charts, projections, case studies. She proved, with numbers and logic, that sustainable and ethical business practices not only avoided financial losses, but actually increased long-term profits. By the end of the meeting, the board had no choice. Henry kept his position as CEO, but more importantly, Reynolds Enterprises would never be the same again. After the presentation, as they walked through the parking lot, Henry finally broke the silence. "Thank you." Charlotte stopped and turned to him. "I didn't do it for you. I did it for what I believe in." Henry smiled. "I know." She sighed, crossing her arms. "This doesn't mean things have changed between us, Henry. I still don't trust you." He nodded. "But does it mean there's a chance?" Charlotte looked at him for a moment. Then she looked away. "Good night, Henry." She got into her car and drove away. Henry stood there, watching her disappear into the distance. He had won back his company, but would he ever win Charlotte back? Henry had conquered impossible challenges. He had rebuilt businesses from nothing, doubled fortunes, crushed competitors. He had always believed that with strategy and money, anything could be fixed. But now, sitting alone in his apartment, staring at the empty space where Charlotte used to sit and read, he realized there was one problem he couldn't solve. Nothing he did was enough. In the past few days, he had tried everything. The relaunch of Fletcher Publishing was a success, with an independent editorial team and guaranteed funding. Reynolds Enterprises was transforming, investing in sustainable projects and policies that protected communities. Even the media had started seeing him differently, not as a ruthless tycoon, but as a reformed businessman. But Charlotte. She remained distant. It was as if, to her, none of it was real. And maybe she was right. That night, Henry decided to find her. He knew where she would be. Since leaving home, Charlotte had started frequenting a small cafe near the university where she worked. A simple, quiet place, with bookshelves lining the walls and old wooden tables that had probably been there for decades. He found her there, sitting in the corner, a notebook open in front of her. She wasn't writing, just twirling a pen between her fingers, lost in thought. When Henry approached, Charlotte looked up, but she didn't seem surprised. "Henry." Her tone wasn't cold or hostile, just neutral. "Can we talk?" She hesitated for a moment, then closed her notebook and nodded. Henry sat across from her, choosing his words carefully. For the first time, he didn't know what to say. "I just wanted to know if you need anything." Charlotte raised an eyebrow. "You mean besides space and time?" Henry let out a tired, quiet laugh. "I think I've given you plenty of that." She sighed, resting her elbows on the table. "Henry, I see what you're doing. But the question isn't what you're changing, it's why you're changing." Henry narrowed his eyes. "What does that mean?" Charlotte held his gaze, her expression unreadable. "You're trying to fix things because you feel guilty. You want to believe that if you do everything right now, it will erase the mistakes of the past." Henry said nothing, because for the first time, someone saw right through him. Charlotte continued, You did all of this expecting that in the end, I'd look at you and say, "Okay, Henry, you've changed. Now we can be together." But that's not how it works. The weight of her words hit him hard. Charlotte sighed, looking away. "I spent a long time hating you, but now I don't even know what I feel." Henry realized that was the most honest thing she had ever said to him, and suddenly he knew exactly what he had to do. He needed to stop trying to win her. That night, when he got home, Henry picked up a pen and paper, and he started writing. He didn't want to send a text, an email, or have someone else deliver a message for him. He needed her to feel this. The letter wasn't meant to convince her of anything. It was just the truth. "Charlotte, I don't know what to expect after writing this. Maybe you'll tear this letter up without reading it. Maybe you'll read it and throw it away. Maybe you'll hate me a little less. Or maybe nothing will change. But that doesn't matter. Because this letter isn't to ask you for anything. Not forgiveness. Not a second chance. It's just because I need to say what I've never said before. I spent my entire life believing that power came from what I could control, from the people I could influence, the deals I could win. But you never fit into that world. You never followed the rules that everyone else did. And because of that, I always saw you as a challenge, something I needed to conquer. I was wrong. I see that now. And if I could go back in time, maybe I'd do everything differently. Maybe I'd never take that ridiculous bet. Maybe I'd never put you through all of this. But I can't change the past. What I can do is move forward the right way, not out of guilt, not because I want to convince you of anything, but because it's the only thing that makes sense now. I'm not the same man I was when this all started. But I understand that doesn't mean you have to take me back. I just wanted you to know." The next day, he placed the letter in a plain envelope. No sender, no signature, just a folded piece of paper with words that for the first time had no strategic purpose. He sent it without expecting an answer, because for the first time in his life, he let fate decide. The letter arrived in a simple envelope, with no sender. But Charlotte knew immediately who it was from. She held it for long minutes before opening it, as if something inside her already knew that once she read it, nothing would be the same. When she finally slid her fingers across the folded paper, her eyes traced each line slowly, absorbing every word. She read it once, then again, and again. In the days that followed, she reread it so many times that the paper started to crease where her fingers kept folding it. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't ignore what she felt. Henry hadn't apologized. He hadn't tried to justify himself. He hadn't begged for another chance. He had simply told the truth. And maybe, for the first time since it all began, she believed him. Charlotte didn't realize how deep in thought she was until Brandon sat beside her at the cafe where she usually worked. "You look like someone who just read something they weren't expecting," he commented, stealing a bite of the cake from her plate without asking. Charlotte sighed, folding the letter and slipping it inside the book she carried with her. "Maybe because I did." Brandon raised an eyebrow. "Henry?" She nodded. "And?" He smirked. "Did he finally admit he's always been an asshole, or is he still trying to cover it up?" Charlotte let out a weak laugh. "He didn't try anything. No apologies, no justifications. He just wrote." Brandon chewed slowly, thoughtful. "Is that a good thing or a bad thing?" Charlotte turned her gaze toward the window. "I don't know." Brandon leaned in slightly. "But you feel something, don't you?" She didn't answer right away. But Brandon already knew the answer. 2 days later, Henry came looking for her. He didn't call first, he didn't text. He just showed up at Margaret's house, knowing it might be a mistake. Charlotte hesitated before opening the door. She didn't know what to expect. But when she finally saw him standing there, she realized something about him had changed. Henry had always been impeccable, always well-dressed, always carrying himself with an air of control, but right now He just looked like a man, no armor, no masks, just Henry. "Hey," he said, his voice calm. Charlotte crossed her arms, trying to ignore the way her heart raced. "What are you doing here?" That's when she noticed he was holding something, but she didn't realize what it was at first. "I needed to see you," he admitted. Charlotte kept her eyes on him, waiting for some rehearsed speech, some grand promise. But Henry said none of that. Instead, he lifted his hand, revealing a small velvet box. Her heart skipped a beat. "Henry, I don't want this to be another contract," he interrupted. His voice was steady, but there was a weight to it. Charlotte didn't move. Henry opened the box. Inside, there was no luxurious ring, no dazzling diamond, no expensive jewelry, just a simple handcrafted silver band with delicate minimal engravings. "This isn't a symbol of status," he continued. "It's not a brand. It's not meant to impress you." He picked up the ring between his fingers, exhaling before he spoke again. "I just want it to be real." Charlotte felt her chest tighten. She wanted to run. She wanted to tell him it was too soon, that she still didn't trust him, that she wasn't sure of anything. But the truth was, she knew. She knew this wasn't the same man who had taken that ridiculous bet months ago. And more than that, she knew she didn't want to fight what she felt anymore. Slowly, Henry took her hand, turning her palm upward, placing the ring there, without pressure, without expectation. "The choice is yours, Charlotte." She felt the cool metal against her skin and looked at him. Henry wasn't begging. He was just waiting. Charlotte looked down at the ring, then at her own hands, then at the open door behind her, and then, finally, she closed her fingers around it. The wedding happened quietly. No spotlights, no headlines, no luxury magazine features, and that was exactly how they wanted it. Charlotte had never dreamed of an extravagant ceremony, and Henry had already had enough grand parties for a lifetime. So it was simple. Just their closest friends, Margaret, Brandon, and a few people who had been part of their journey. No contracts, no obligations, just them. Charlotte wore a light dress, no excess, no sparkles, no unnecessary grandeur. Henry wore a discreet suit, no designer labels, no need to impress anyone. When they stood before the altar, set in a garden filled with books, a detail Charlotte adored, there was no doubt, no hesitation, only certainty. Henry held her hands tightly. "No bets this time," he said with a smile. Charlotte smiled back. "Just us." And when they said, "I do," Henry realized he had never wanted anything more in his life. The months that followed brought changes that once seemed impossible. Reynolds Enterprises, now renewed, became a model of sustainable and responsible business. Projects were reassessed, contracts rewritten. Henry still faced resistance from some investors, but he proved that profit and social impact could coexist. And, to his surprise, the market responded positively. The company grew stronger, attracting new partners and gaining recognition for its new business vision. He had won, but this time the right way. Meanwhile, Charlotte dedicated herself to the Fletcher Foundation, a project created to support writers, teachers, and educational initiatives. Her dream was finally taking shape, and for the first time in his life, Henry felt no need to control anything. He simply admired the woman by his side and the real impact they were making on the world. But then, one last event changed everything. Charlotte felt the first signs when a wave of dizziness made her grip the kitchen counter for support. "You okay?" Henry asked, frowning. She took a deep breath, forcing a smile. "Just tired." But it wasn't just that. In the days that followed, the symptoms continued. Mild morning nausea, an exhaustion she couldn't explain. And then a pharmacy test confirmed it. She was pregnant. Charlotte sat on the edge of the bed, holding that small plastic test with a mix of emotions she couldn't quite define. She and Henry had never talked about children. Their marriage was still recent, and before that, their entire relationship had been a battlefield of pride, redemption, and discovery. Now, everything was about to change again. No matter how much she knew Henry wasn't the same man he once was, a part of her still hesitated to tell him. What if he didn't want this? What if the weight of true commitment made him walk away? The Henry from before would have run. But the Henry now, she wasn't sure. That night, over dinner, Henry noticed she was restless. Something happened. Charlotte pressed her lips together, trying to find the right words, but there was no right way to say it, so she simply pulled the pregnancy test from her coat pocket and placed it on the table. Henry stared at it for a few seconds, not understanding at first, but when realization hit, his eyes widened. He picked up the test carefully, as if it was something fragile, then looked at Charlotte. "You—" Charlotte held her breath. "I'm pregnant." The silence that followed was brief, but it felt like an eternity. And then he smiled, but not just any smile, not his usual arrogant smirk, not a smile of victory. It was a smile of pure emotion, of genuine happiness. Henry ran a hand through his hair, exhaling a quiet laugh, as if he still couldn't believe it. "We're having a baby." Charlotte finally released the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Yes." He laughed again, and without thinking, he stood up and pulled her into his arms. "Oh my God, Charlotte," he whispered into her hair. "Is this real?" She smiled against his chest. "It's real." Henry pulled back slightly, just enough to look into her eyes. "You were afraid to tell me?" Charlotte hesitated. "I didn't know how you'd react." He cupped her face in his hands, his eyes shining in a way she had never seen before. "Charlotte." His voice broke for just a second, full of emotion. "I've never been sure about anything in my life until now, but this I'm sure of." She stared at him, and in that moment she knew. He was a different man. Not because of guilt, not because of regret, but because he had chosen to change. When their son was born, Henry held him in his arms for the first time and felt something he had never felt before. A weight, a responsibility, but above all, a peace he had never known. He had spent his life chasing achievements, money, power. But now, standing there holding his son in his arms and looking at Charlotte by his side, he finally understood. This was his greatest victory. I hope you enjoyed today's story. If you did, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought about the story. See you in the next video.